When Melania Trump initiated litigation against Jasmine Crockett, few anticipated the proceeding evolving into a national examination until a specific testimony exposed reality, altering the entire landscape in under 10 seconds. Immediately upon the news breaking, a palpable shockwave seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of Washington, D.C. Former First Lady Melania Trump was suing Representative Jasmine Crockett on counts of defamation. This was not mere hearsay or idle conjecture. It constituted an actual lawsuit with Melania Trump's signature affixed prominently at the apex. To numerous citizens across the country, the uncertainty did not concern whether this would ignite a firestorm, but how extensive that conflagration would ultimately become. Consider the gravity. A former First Lady, typically known for maintaining silence during political skirmishes, had chosen to initiate litigation against an emerging figure within the Democratic Party. That single fact sufficed to ensure a barrage of cameras outside the venue, swarms of journalists on site, and continuous coverage, filling broadcast schedules with relentless analysis. However, the aspect that genuinely astonished observers was the realization that this litigation centered neither on policy disagreements nor on congressional power dynamics. Instead, the crux involved spoken words, incisive and straightforward statements uttered by Jasmine Crockett, which Melania's legal representation alleged had transgressed acceptable bounds into the realm of defamation. Within our contemporary environment, where any single sentence can be instantly isolated, shared online, looped, and scrutinized, the potential consequences truly could not have been more significant. The initial proceedings commenced at the federal courthouse located in Dallas. Early that morning, the atmosphere was thick with characteristic Texas humidity, yet the oppressive heat did not deter the substantial gathering. Individuals protesting with hand-painted placards stood immediately adjacent to Trump loyalists prominently displaying flags. Media personnel leaned over security barriers, directing questions toward any individual wearing formal attire who passed their position. A local resident stationed on the corner holding a cold beverage quietly remarked to a companion, "This feels far more significant than a standard trial. It feels like witnessing history." Inside, the environment was heavy with anticipation, with solid wooden spectator benches occupied by reporters, legal analysts, and interested citizens who had successfully navigated the entry crowds to secure frontal viewing. Two distinct figures whose life trajectories could not be more divergent were present. Melania, displaying an elegant and reserved demeanor with highly calculated movements, and Crockett appearing fervent and unyielding with a focused gaze challenging any attempt to silence her. "Mrs. Trump versus Representative Crockett," the court clerk announced. Those specific words resonated throughout the chamber, and at that precise moment, every eye turned toward the front. This did not represent merely another legal dispute. It was viewed as a confrontation between enduring legacies. To grasp the reasons this conflict held such immense significance, one must understand the identity of Jasmine Crockett. She is decidedly not the sort of individual who cautiously navigates around political controversy. As a freshman representative from Texas, she established her professional standing through assertive pronouncements, rigorous interrogation of political adversaries, and acting as a voice for populations frequently overlooked in legislative halls. She does not utilize subtle communication, rather she projects her stance dynamically. This approach accounts partially for the rapid national attention she received and also explains why someone as insulated as Melania Trump would accept the risk of confronting her directly in a court of law. Nevertheless, legal disputes are notoriously complex undertakings. Melania's legal team maintained that Crockett's specific observations were not merely typical political commentary. They allege she made suggestions concerning Melania's participation in certain financial arrangements, implications deemed sufficiently injurious to precipitate this judicial confrontation. To those supporting Melania, this action concerned the preservation of personal dignity and the establishment of boundaries. To Crockett's constituency, it appeared to be a deliberate attempt to suppress a prominent voice that had disconcerted the established order. Cameras flashed incessantly as legal counsel entered the chamber, and reporters recorded notes as rapidly as physically possible. Every minor detail possessed significance. The specific hue of Melania's attire, the nuanced expression on Crockett's countenance, and even the precise manner in which each woman adjusted her physical posture. This heightened scrutiny existed because universally it was understood this case extended far beyond standard courtroom parameters. It concerned public image, societal perception, and the controlling narrative. Crockett leaned toward her legal representative and conveyed something in a whisper, receiving a subtle nod in response. Melania exhibited no visible reaction, her countenance remaining enigmatic, though she gripped her pen tightly against her organizational folder. These two individuals were not solely polarized by differing ideologies, they were fundamentally distinct in their core approaches. Melania carefully cultivated a public persona defined by reserve, utilizing speech only when deemed absolutely essential. Crockett was vocal and courageous, her actual presence serving as a direct challenge to established power dynamics. The initial minutes of that specific morning established one certainty without question. Regardless of the final judicial verdict, this proceeding would leave neither participant unaffected. Professional reputations would be scrutinized, confidential information would be alluded to, and the entire populace would be observing closely, awaiting the catalyst that might trigger consequences far larger than either individual involved. Outside the facility, synchronized chants escalated in volume. Some individuals shouted words of encouragement for Melania, labeling Crockett's actions as irresponsible, while others vocalized support for Jasmine, commending her bravery in taking a stand even when facing significant opposition. Law enforcement personnel formed lines along the entrance steps to prevent the simmering tension from escalating into physical conflict. Yet inside, within that wood-paneled courtroom where contemporary history was actively being documented, the silence between legal arguments resonated more intensely than the shouting occurring outdoors. Everyone present intuitively sensed it. This proceeding was not solely about a defamation statute, but rather centered on the concepts of actual truth versus public perception, courage opposing control, and the high-stakes gamble inherent in bringing spoken words into a court of law. However, before the opening argument was even presented, people were already speculating about who would emerge from this ordeal viewed with greater respect and who might depart with their enduring legacy irreparably fractured. If one intends to comprehend precisely why this specific litigation generated such a massive reaction, it is essential to understand the actual identity of Jasmine Crockett. Not the person described in news headings or political talking points, but the substantive history behind the passionate voice that ultimately placed her in that courtroom opposite Melania Trump. Jasmine Crockett did not ascend through the political hierarchy in an unassuming manner. Before she ever occupied a seat in Congress, she established her reputation within Dallas courtrooms, providing legal defense for individuals lacking the financial means or influential connections to protect themselves. She was the specific attorney who would answer late-night calls from distressed mothers whose sons faced arrest, or from fathers fearful of losing employment over a misunderstanding. Residents in those specific neighborhoods did not identify Jasmine solely as legal counsel. They recognized her as an individual who genuinely cared enough to fight on their behalf. Jasmine absolutely never retreated from a challenging case, recollected Andre Phillips, a local community activist who had collaborated with her years prior. She was intimidated neither by judges nor prosecutors nor anyone else. She firmly believed in looking individuals in the eye and conveying the actual truth, even when it was unpleasant. That direct candor, incisive enough to sting and fearless enough to cause disturbance, was the precise quality that propelled her from regional politics all the way to Washington, D.C. She did not polish her language for comfortable consumption. Instead, she honed it to achieve maximum impact, and that strategy proved effective. When Jasmine secured her congressional seat, detractors assumed she would eventually become more moderate, learning to engage in the political game as so many others do once they arrive in the nation's capital. However, she did not conform to that expectation. If anything changed, her voice only increased in volume during committee proceedings, in media interviews, and across various social media platforms. Crockett became recognized for responding immediately and forcefully when someone attempted to interrupt her or minimize her arguments. She was not merely advocating for herself, she was representing every constituent who had informed her, "We lack a voice in that place." That open defiance of traditional political protocol transformed her into a specific target. Corporate lobbyists disapproved of her. Veteran politicians dismissed her presence with eye rolls when she entered, and conservative media outlets characterized her as reckless, while progressives perceived her as a refreshing change. Throughout all of this, Jasmine appeared entirely unfazed. Consequently, when she articulated comments referencing Melania Trump's function during specific Trump-era transactions, nobody was genuinely astonished by the audibility of her remarks. However, observers were certainly taken aback by the subsequent reaction. Rather than disregarding her and dismissing the comments as mere political theater, Melania initiated legal proceedings. Why her? One journalist inquired during a morning talk program. Why, out of all the detractors the Trump family has encountered, single out this specific congresswoman? That inquiry persisted in public discourse because Jasmine was neither the most widely recognized name in Congress nor the most influential member. She did not preside over a major committee, nor was she pursuing the presidency, yet somehow she had aggravated a nerve sufficiently sensitive that the former First Lady of the United States determined to pursue legal action against her in court. Part of the reasoning involved Crockett's distinct lack of fear. She was not the type of person who could be coerced into silence through intimidation. Legal threats did not cause her to lose composure. If anything, they served as motivation, and that characteristic was hazardous for someone in Melania's position. Melania had constructed her public persona based on elements of control, elegance, and a deliberate distance from political controversy. Jasmine was her absolute antithesis, raw, candid, and entirely unwilling to offer apologies. Furthermore, profound symbolism was involved. For millions observing the situation, this did not represent merely a technical legal conflict between two individuals. It constituted a direct collision between two highly distinct versions of America. On one side stood a congresswoman from modest origins who worked tirelessly through law school and established her public platform by being intentionally unfiltered. On the opposite side was a former First Lady possessing global recognition and a name explicitly associated with vast wealth, immense power, and a meticulously managed image. When the legal papers were filed, Jasmine did not retreat from the challenge. In fact, she engaged even more aggressively, standing outside her constituent office in Dallas and informing journalists of her stance. If articulating the actual truth regarding power places me in a courtroom environment, then that is precisely where I am required to be. I do not flee, and I do not conceal myself. Those specific declarations were broadcast on a continuous loop across various news networks. Supporters vigorously applauded her courage, while critics characterized her behavior as arrogance. Nevertheless, everyone concurred on one singular point. Jasmine Crockett was not experiencing fear. That attribute was the critical element, the distinct fearlessness. It is what rendered her a potent force in the political arena, what made her dynamic to her constituency, and what transformed this lawsuit into something far more significant than mere legal documentation. It evolved into a definitive test of whether an individual who had consistently spoken truth regarding power could endure a direct confrontation from one of the nation's most formidable figures. Her staff, however, observed the considerable pressure existing behind the resolute public declarations. Late evenings in her office revealed piles of legal documentation on her desk, and Jasmine sometimes massaged her temples, fully cognizant of the high stakes involved. "They intend to break me," she confessed to a trusted aide. "But if I succumb to pressure now, I will never genuinely be capable of standing up again." The litigation was not solely concerning the clearing of her name. For Jasmine, it represented fundamental survival, not only professionally, but personally as well. If she were to lose, she risked being permanently labeled as irresponsible. If she were to prevail, she would demonstrate that even the highest office in the nation possessed no power to silence her. While Jasmine's open defiance dominated headlines, the larger unresolved question persisted. What precisely motivated Melania to risk immense public scrutiny by pursuing this legal action in the first place? For numerous years, Melania Trump cultivated a distinct reputation centered on reserve, while her husband dominated headlines and actively courted controversy. She remained positioned mostly in the background. Her verbal pronouncements were rare, her public appearances were highly calculated, and her image was meticulously managed. Consequently, when news circulated that she had determined to sue Representative Jasmine Crockett, observers were genuinely astounded. This action was not merely unusual, it was without historical precedent. No First Lady in contemporary times had ever initiated litigation against a sitting member of Congress over allegations of defamation. Thus, the pressing inquiry was, why choose this moment and why focus on Crockett? Beneath the perfectly polished exterior, Melania's world had consistently been more vulnerable than it appeared. Occupying the role of First Lady did not concern only fashion choices and formal events. It entailed being subjected to intense scrutiny at every conceivable turn. Her motivations were constantly questioned, and her personal life was minutely analyzed. While she succeeded in maintaining a specific aura of mystique, Crockett's pointed observations had effectively penetrated that meticulously assembled defense. According to Melania's legal counsel, the Congresswoman's comments extended far beyond routine political critique. They alleged Crockett had insinuated participation in covert arrangements that could permanently damage Melania's enduring reputation. For a woman who had invested years in crafting an image defined by elegance and detachment from Washington's inherent turmoil, those specific words were not viewed as merely insulting, they were perceived as dangerous. "She is not acting to protect her husband in this instance," remarked one legal commentator on a national news network. "She is acting to protect herself." This litigation concerns her own identity and her own dignity within the East Wing. Advisors deliberated for several weeks prior to the lawsuit's filing. Some individuals argued that taking action would only provide Crockett with increased visibility, portraying her as a courageous fighter opposing entrenched power. Others maintained that remaining silent would be interpreted as a distinct sign of weakness. Ultimately, Melania made the final decision herself. "I will absolutely not permit lies to stand unchallenged," she reportedly informed a trusted aide, her tone described as uncharacteristically sharp and firm. Her choice carried substantial inherent risks. By filing the lawsuit, she subjected herself to intense scrutiny, including potential depositions, rigorous cross-examinations, and the press investigating her personal history, elements she had long attempted to avoid. Yet, Melania was not acting on sudden impulse. She genuinely believed this case could serve as her defining moment to demonstrate strength on her own terms. Supporters rallied to her side. At organized gatherings in Texas and Florida, women displayed placards reading, "Protect Melania's dignity." Conservative commentators commended her for finally initiating a counterattack, and even some persistent critics conceded that the move was bold. However, boldness is a quality that can cut both ways. For Jasmine Crockett, the litigation was perceived as an immense opportunity. "You have essentially just handed her a microphone," stated political strategist Karen Verrill on MSNBC. "Now Crockett is not required to fight just to be heard. This case guarantees her broadcast time every single day." Nevertheless, Melania was certainly no stranger to managing risk. She had successfully navigated through various public scandals previously, maintaining her composed demeanor when others likely would have completely crumbled. She possessed confidence that her legal team could effectively handle the challenge posed by Crockett. However, the nature of legal disputes is that once they are initiated, absolute control inevitably slips away. Judges render independent decisions, witnesses disclose closely guarded secrets, and investigative journalists probe precisely where you least expect them to, and therein lay the inherent danger. By taking Crockett to a court of law, Melania was not solely defending her public image, she was fundamentally gambling with it. Inside the courtroom facility, her attorney articulated arguments in deliberate, controlled tones, characterizing Crockett's specific remarks as reckless slander that intentionally blurred the critical distinction between verified truth and dynamic fiction. They emphasized Crockett's characteristic passionate style and her established reputation for utilizing sharp language designed to inflict damage. This proceeding is absolutely not about political disagreements, Melania's lead counsel declared emphatically. It is about the concept of accountability. It is about preserving the personal integrity of the First Lady of the United States. Melania herself maintained her silence throughout the majority of the proceedings, her countenance remaining entirely unreadable. Yet every so often she recorded personal notes and unobtrusively conveyed them to her legal counsel. Observers characterized her demeanor as intensely calm, presenting a sharp contrast to the palpable buzzing energy enveloping the immediate surroundings. For a brief period, it appeared the legal strategy might actually succeed. The arguments presented were clean, and the underlying legal foundation seemed structured solidly. However, beneath that polished surface, structural cracks were already beginning to manifest. This vulnerability existed because every single defamation case carries a specific burden of proof, and presenting that proof requires concrete evidence, credible testimony, and proper context. Crockett's legal representatives understood that requirement perfectly. They did not merely prepare a standard legal defense, they structured an aggressive, comprehensive legal offense. Meanwhile, commentators situated outside the courthouse facility analyzed and debated Melania's underlying motives without end. Some individuals framed the action as a matter of personal pride, while others proposed it was a highly calculated strategic distraction from various other controversies currently swirling throughout Washington. One late-night television host even joked, "When you're the First Lady actively suing a congresswoman, that's not referred to as defamation. It's called high television ratings." Yet, despite all the prevalent cynicism, a far deeper layer of meaning existed here. Melania had consistently served as a public symbol of elegance, reserve, and complete control. By filing this specific lawsuit, she was attempting to redefine herself publicly as someone who absolutely would not be intimidated or pushed around. However, symbols are inherently fragile constructs, and when they begin to crack, they often shatter with remarkable speed. The journalists stationed outside the Dallas courthouse understood they were witnessing a historic event. This was not viewed as merely a complex legal case. It was seen as a dynamic collision of distinct personalities, professional reputations, and the fundamental concept of who possesses the authority to define actual truth within America. For Melania, the inherent risk was truly monumental. Conversely, for Jasmine Crockett, the resulting opportunity was perceived as priceless. Yet if Melania firmly believed she possessed the stronger legal argument, she was swiftly about to understand that courtroom conflicts are not exclusively won by attorneys. They are often won by specific moments. And one particular moment was rapidly approaching that would completely turn the entire trial on its head. Dallas's Earl Cabell Federal Building had previously accommodated various high-profile judicial proceedings, but nothing comparable to this specific event. From the moment of sunrise, the courthouse exterior resembled less a sober venue of justice and more the dynamic epicenter of a significant national spectacle. Satellite broadcast trucks lined the entire street, and media personnel traveling from as far away as Los Angeles and Miami jostled aggressively for prime camera positions. A contingent of university students from nearby Southern Methodist University had actually camped overnight just to possess the ability to say they were present. Inside, the climate control hummed softly against the intense Texas heat, yet the palpable tension within the packed courtroom made the atmosphere feel thick and almost suffocating. The distinct aroma of coffee drifted through the air from paper cups gripped by fatigued journalists who had not slept properly for several days. Everyone in attendance leaned forward in anticipation, waiting for the official gavel to signal the start of proceedings. On the frontal bench, Melania Trump was seated with immaculate posture, wearing a sharp beige suit with her hair styled in its characteristic polished wave. Every physical movement of her hand, whether subtly adjusting her pen or lifting a glass of water, appeared entirely deliberate and highly practiced. A few feet distant, Jasmine Crockett radiated a fundamentally different kind of vibrant energy. She was leaning slightly forward in her chair, rapidly flipping through organizational notes and occasionally conveying whispers to her attorney. Unlike Melania, whose countenance revealed absolutely nothing of her internal state, Crockett's facial expressions constantly flickered, showing irritation when a camera clicked too loudly, amusement when her aide relayed a sly comment, and steely resolve whenever her gaze drifted toward Melania's table. Reporters whispered among themselves, observing, "They do not even acknowledge one another with a glance." The presiding judge, a tall individual with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, entered with efficiency and assumed his seat. "Court is now in session," he declared, his voice carrying the significant weight of professional routine, yet even he appeared cognizant that this was no ordinary legal proceeding. As the official actions commenced, Melania's lead attorney, Philip Ransom, rose to deliver his remarks, his tone smooth and almost theatrical, meticulously crafted for both the specific jury members and the watching cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, the essence of this case is simple. Representative Crockett deliberately exceeded the established boundaries of protected free speech. She did not criticize a specific policy, nor did she question a broader political strategy. She explicitly accused the First Lady of the United States of distinct impropriety in matters for which she possessed absolutely no concrete evidence. These harmful statements were broadcast nationally, repeated incessantly, and genuinely believed by millions of individuals. That does not constitute politics. That constitutes defamation." A distinct murmur of reactions swept through the entire courtroom gallery. Crockett rapidly recorded a personal note and slid it across to her attorney, Linda Garvey, who smirked briefly before unobtrusively tucking the note into her organizational folder. When Ransom concluded his remarks and resumed his seat, Garvey rose to speak, her stride purposeful and her voice cutting through the air with precision. "This trial absolutely is not concerned with preserving dignity. It is concerned with silencing legitimate dissent. My client spoke publicly regarding influence, transparency, and essential accountability, the very qualities we fundamentally expect of our leaders. Mrs. Trump may intensely dislike what was articulated, but personal dislike is not equivalent to defamation. Actual truth is not defamation, and attempting to silence a sitting member of Congress for performing her designated job establishes a profoundly dangerous precedent." Crockett glanced towards the jury as Garvey spoke, making direct eye contact with a middle-aged woman in the frontal row who was writing furiously in her notebook. The atmosphere in the room thickened noticeably as both legal teams laid out their primary opening arguments. Every single sentence appeared specifically designed not just for the 12 jurors present, but also for the millions following the events on television broadcasts and online platforms. A reporter representing the Dallas Morning News tapped rapidly at her laptop keyboard, muttering to herself, "This is certainly going to be labeled the trial of the decade." On the spectator benches positioned behind them, individuals whispered back and forth dynamic reactions. A man wearing a worn baseball cap leaned toward his wife and stated softly, "I do not care what your political opinions are. Seeing the First Lady actively sue a congresswoman is wild." At one point during an official recess, Crockett stood near the legal defense table while sipping water, and a reporter called out from the gallery, "Congresswoman, do you regret making your comments?" She did not show any hesitation in responding. "Regret?" she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the entire room. "The only thing I genuinely regret is how remarkably fragile the truth appears to be for certain people." The pointed remark elicited visible chuckles from her supporters and sharp disapproving looks from Melania's legal team. Back in official session, tension mounted steadily as specific witnesses were called forward to testify regarding the actual impact of Crockett's public comments. A political consultant provided detailed descriptions of how her remarks had been replayed relentlessly across major networks, actively sparking national headlines. Melania's attorneys placed heavy emphasis on the measurable harm inflicted upon her reputation, but Crockett's team countered with the obvious argument. Specific public figures live directly in the spotlight, and criticism inevitably comes with the role. By the late afternoon, even the presiding judge seemed cognizant that this case was no longer strictly confined to technical defamation statutes. It was actively transforming into a broader battle over the concept of free speech itself. His gavel knocked forcefully against the bench following a heated exchange that erupted between the opposing attorneys. "Control yourselves," he warned them sternly, though his authoritative voice did little to effectively settle the intensely charged energy filling the room. Cameras were absolutely not permitted inside the chamber, but that restriction did not stop sketch artists from furiously capturing every single glance, every raised eyebrow, and every subtle flicker of emotion passing between the two women. One specific sketch depicted Crockett leaning dynamically forward, her finger pointed sharply across the table, while Melania stared straight ahead with her lips pressed tightly together. As the day's proceedings wound down, the air inside the courtroom felt even heavier and more oppressive than when it began. Both sides had clearly drawn their battle lines, and neither woman had flinched under the pressure. And though only the proverbial first stones had been thrown in this conflict, it was abundantly clear to everyone present that this was going to be a fight unlike anything the country had ever witnessed before. Yet the genuine turning point was not contained within the opening arguments. It was positioned just ahead, residing in the specific details of Melania's case and the aggressive defense Crockett's team was prepared to unleash. By the second morning of the judicial proceeding, the courtroom's operational rhythm had already been firmly established. Reporters sprinted up the courthouse steps prior to sunrise, gripping phones and laptops tightly, while security lines extended around the entire block. Inside, the benches were rapidly occupied by a diverse mix of political aides, curious law students, and everyday Texans who had never previously seen a first lady in person. When the judge provided a definitive nod, Philip Ransom, Melania Trump's lead attorney, rose to speak with deliberate confidence. He wore a navy suit that appeared freshly pressed despite the humid Dallas air, and his voice filled the chamber with a precise clarity honed by decades of extensive courtroom experience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he commenced, "words possess significant consequences. This legal case is not about political disagreements, it is about personal reputation, and it is about the actual truth." Representative Crockett deliberately crossed the established line when she publicly accused the First Lady of participation in matters that possessed absolutely no basis in fact. These were not casual, offhand remarks. These were serious accusations broadcast and amplified to millions of citizens. And those specific words caused real, measurable damage. He paused for a dramatic effect, allowing the resulting silence to hang heavy in the air for a moment. Then he proceeded, "The First Lady is not present here as a politician. She is present as a woman, as a wife, and as a mother whose name has been deliberately smeared. We are formally asking you to hold Representative Crockett accountable for her actions." The jurors sat with stone-faced expressions, pens scratching dynamically across notebooks. Positioned behind them, journalists typed with furious speed. Melania maintained her hands folded neatly in her lap, her countenance remaining expressionless, though occasionally she leaned slightly toward Ransom to whisper something too quietly for others to catch. Ransom then called the first witness to the stand, a media analyst from Arizona named Simon Leary. Leary specialized in tracking the precise manner stories spread across television broadcasts and social media platforms. He displayed comprehensive graphs and charts illustrating how Crockett's remarks had been clipped, shared online, and replayed thousands of times in the weeks immediately following her articulation of them. These specific comments did not remain confined to Washington, Leary explained. They spread nationally, became an integral part of the continuous news cycle, and each repetition magnified the resulting damage to the First Lady's public image. Ransom nodded in understanding. "In your professional estimation, did Representative Crockett's public statements impact the specific way Americans perceive the First Lady?" "Yes," Larry replied firmly. "They painted her in a light that was both damaging and misleading." The jury recorded detailed notes. Crockett sat back in her chair, her pen tapping lightly against the table, and her eyes locked onto the witness with a gaze that possessed intense focus. Next, Ransom brought forward a public relations consultant named Dana Mercer from Phoenix, who provided testimony regarding the significant toll reputational damage can take. She spoke extensively about lost organizational opportunities, strained relationships with various entities, and the enduring shadow cast by public scandal. "If people believe a false narrative even a single time, the damage lingers long after it is corrected," Mercer stated. "That is the fundamental nature of public perception." Ransom turned squarely toward the jury. This is not about standard criticism of policy. This is about reckless words aimed directly at a person, and that specific person is sitting right here. He gestured significantly toward Melania. For the first time since the trial commenced, Melania's eyes lifted toward the jury panel. She did not offer a smile, nor did she frown. She simply looked at them with a steady gaze, suggesting both resolve and underlying fragility. However, while Melania's case appeared strong on public optics, structural cracks began to manifest under rigorous questioning. When Crockett's attorney, Linda Garvey, rose for the cross-examination, the tonal quality shifted dramatically. "Mr. Leary," Garvey began smoothly, "you have testified that Representative Crockett's words spread rapidly across the country. Is that correct?" "Yes, that is accurate." "Would you concur that the First Lady is already considered one of the most intensely scrutinized women in the entire world?" Leary hesitated. "Yes." "And would you also concur that public figures are inherently subject to criticism, sometimes intensely harsh criticism, as part of their public roles?" "Yes." "So in actual fact, what you are stating is not that Representative Crockett created scrutiny, but rather that she contributed to a continuous cycle of criticism that already existed." Ransom immediately objected, but the judge allowed the question to stand. Leary shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "That is one specific way of interpreting it, yes." The jurors glanced at each other meaningfully, and reporters typed even faster. Garvey pressed further with Mercer, the PR consultant. "You spoke extensively about reputational damage, but tell me, if a statement is true, is it still legally considered defamation?" "No," Mercer admitted. "And who ultimately possesses the authority to decide if it is true or false?" "That would be for the court to determine." "Exactly." That was the precise answer Garvey wanted. She smiled subtly and then returned to her seat. The operational momentum seemed to waver. Melania's case had commenced strongly, but Crockett's legal team had already begun identifying and poking holes in the foundation. During the lunch recess, media personnel crowded the courthouse steps, microphones thrust in every direction. A journalist from the Texas Tribune inquired bluntly, "If Melania prevails, does that mean every member of Congress must subsequently watch their words, or does it mean she is protecting herself from lies?" Where precisely is the line? Inside, Melania sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her attorneys huddled closely around her. Crockett, meanwhile, laughed with her legal team, the sound carrying across the chamber. To outside observers, it resembled two entirely distinct worlds, one steeped in controlled reserve, the other vibrant with defiant energy. By the conclusion of the day, jurors had heard the core arguments of Melania's case. Words hold significance, reputations matter, and Crockett's comments produced real consequences. But what absolutely no one could accurately predict was how dramatically the operational balance of power would shift once Crockett's side took its designated turn. However, when it came time for Jasmine Crockett's defense, her lawyers were not merely prepared to respond, they were fully ready to flip the controlling narrative on its head. By the time the defense team took the floor, the courtroom was actively buzzing with immense anticipation. Journalists had already commenced framing the trial as a definitive test of free speech opposing reputation. Crockett sat composed at her table, arms folded, her countenance calm, but her vibrant energy was unmistakable, resembling a focused boxer waiting for the bell to signal the round. Her attorney, Linda Garvey, rose with a thick organizational binder in hand, but her opening statement was delivered entirely without reference to notes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Garvey stated, her voice sharp yet steady, "this legal case is absolutely not about preserving dignity. It is about silencing a crucial voice. A voice that has asked challenging questions, a voice that has articulated truth regarding influence and power. Representative Crockett did not invent anything. She publicly said what millions of Americans were already asking. And now the former First Lady desires to punish her for articulating it out loud." A palpable ripple ran through the spectator gallery. Crockett glanced toward the jury, locking eyes with a man in the back row who leaned significantly forward in his chair. She did not smile, but her focused gaze conveyed a clear message. I am not afraid to stand here, not afraid. Garvey called her first witness to the stand, a political historian named Dr. Anthony Ward from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Ward explained the long-standing tradition of elected officials rigorously questioning the behavior and actions of public figures. Democracy fundamentally depends on scrutiny, he testified. Public criticism is not only permitted, it is explicitly expected. If we punish representatives for speaking regarding those in established power, we weaken the entire democratic system. Ransom rose rapidly for cross-examination. Dr. Ward, are you suggesting that any public official can state whatever they desire, regardless of how damaging it may be, without any accountability? Ward did not blink or hesitate. I am stating that criticism of public figures is a fundamental cornerstone of democracy. If accountability comes at the cost of silencing legitimate dissent, we risk losing something far greater than any single reputation. Crockett leaned toward Garvey and whispered, "That is the critical line right there." Garvey nodded in agreement. The next witness brought even more dynamic fire to the proceedings. A community organizer from Fort Worth, Angela Moreno, who testified passionately about Crockett's extensive history of advocacy. She has always been our voice. She says the things the rest of us are too afraid to say. If she gets sued for doing that, what realistic chance do the rest of us have? Ransom immediately objected, labeling the testimony irrelevant, but the judge allowed the statement to stand. Finally, it was time for Crockett herself to take the witness stand. The courtroom hushed completely as she rose, walked with purpose to the witness chair, and placed her hand firmly on the Bible. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised for action. Congresswoman Crockett, Garvey commenced, why did you make the specific comments that led to this lawsuit? Crockett's voice was even and composed, but every single word carried significant weight. Because I firmly believe the American people deserve absolute transparency. Because when you observe distinct patterns of influence, you do not remain quiet. And because being in Congress is not about protecting the powerful, it is about protecting the everyday people who sent me there. Garvey permitted the resulting silence to stretch for effect, then inquired, did you intend to harm the First Lady personally? No, Crockett answered firmly. I intended to shine light where too many people prefer darkness. If that is considered harm, then we seriously need to question what we are protecting in this country. Ransom rose for cross-examination, adjusting his tie before stepping forward confidently. Congresswoman, you understand the significant weight of your words, do you not? I do. And you admit that your comments suggested Mrs. Trump was involved in questionable dealings? I admit I raised valid questions, Crockett shot back directly. Questions based on specific patterns we all witnessed. So you possess no direct evidence? Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice low but steady. Evidence does not appear out of thin air, Mr. Ransom. Sometimes it requires someone asking the uncomfortable question to bring it into the light. The jury's eyes flickered between the two adversarial participants. Ransom pressed again. You are stating that you made damaging statements without concrete proof. Crockett did not hesitate. I am stating I did my designated job, and if doing my job entails upsetting powerful people, so be it. The courtroom immediately erupted in whispers. The judge's gavel slammed down forcefully. Order! Lay! Crockett sat back in her chair entirely unbothered, her chin lifted slightly. She was not merely defending herself, she was articulating a broader fundamental point. This proceeding was not about her versus Melania Trump. It was about the fundamental right to question power.